It is a delight to be here. Thank you for the warm introduction. I really appreciate it. There we go. And my journey starts basically 2 miles north of here, 25 years ago. I used to write this paper newsletter for Esther Dyson. And back in the day, I probably heard 4,000 different startup pitches. So I was like a trends analyst in the startup era. And I realized one day that I didn't like this word, that I didn't like the word consumer. I'm like, well, why does this word bother me? Why does it grate? And I paid attention to it for a while. And as I thought about it, I realized that there was a moment, one of the moments when this actually began to be an issue for me was when I had a lunch with the new incoming CEO of Women.com. Now, Women.com started as Women's Wire, founded by Ellen Pack, before kind of the internet becomes big as this online destination, and was doing really, really well. And I was excited for this meeting. I was thinking, okay, the glass ceiling, abuses in the workplace, the things that have bubbled up recently as the Me Too movement, all these kinds of issues that women could be collecting up and doing interesting things. And she sits down across from me. We're sitting in the Mesa Grill, and one of the first sentences out of her mouth is, my job is to sell women to advertisers. And this is complete truth in advertising on her part. She is being completely frank and honest with me. She comes out of media. But my heart just fell. My heart almost broke. And I thought, this is some strange kind of betrayal of trust. Like, Women.com is in some sense bait, and these women are going to be sold to advertisers, and that's sort of the top of mind in the CEO's head, and I couldn't really get my head around it. So that started me down this journey. But before I take you further down the journey, I want to do a little bit of framing for what on earth is this trust thing, because trust is a weird little issue. If you look in the dictionary, trust is a firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. A commonly used model is this ABI model: ability, benevolence, and integrity. Right? Is this person capable of doing the thing they want to do? Do they have my best interests at heart? And do they have some kind of moral principles about it? Or are they going to go tell the next person? Another word that you might associate here is predictability. Are they going to consistently do the thing they're going to do? And this opens up some interesting ways of looking at trust. So one model says, well, why don't we split it into two? Where there's cognitive trust, that almost the intellectual belief that you're predictable to do this thing next time, and you also are capable of doing it, which explains to us why Lucy is trustworthy and that she's always going to pull the ball before Charlie Brown actually gets to kick it. It's also why we can trust that Dr. Evil will always try to kill Austin Powers, although we have to question his ability to do so. But it also explains why a bunch of people might actually trust 45 to do a particular thing, even if they don't necessarily warm to his personality. The other half of this model is affective trust, is really about the heart and the feeling. It explains, for example, among many things, why in some cultures you go out and drink heavily and socialize and get to know people and spend a lot of time outside of the business place or meeting place before you go do business, because they need to know who you are in some other dimension. That's interesting. So trust, because we are social creatures, is foundational. It's very much about the basis of who we are in society. It's very specific. So I would trust David Reed, for example, with my proxy vote on any issue relating to telecom, but I don't know about his immigration policy. I would trust some companies to be world global gold standard on not paying any bribery payments around the world, but they might treat their employees very, very, very terribly. So it's very specific, and you earn it over time. Trust comes to you over time. It's indirect. So if somebody says, hey, trust me. No, come on, trust me. That doesn't feel very trustworthy, right? And that's what companies do when they're advertising to you. Hey, trust me. Trust is also transitive. So if Mika or Andrew send me a note to say, that says, you need to meet so-and-so, I immediately contact that person and try to meet them. It's also contagious, meaning in some venues, in some rooms, you can tell when things have shifted and suddenly the level of trust has gone up. And you can also tell when someone just, pissed in the pot and basically broke trust in the room and things have gone down. And these things happen. So trust is kind of fragile and complicated. So let me give you a little complicated proposition about trust, which is that we've stopped trusting humans. Not all of us, not all the time. A bunch of us are still sort of optimists. This might be a filter for optimists, this room itself, as Danielle was saying earlier. But we stopped trusting humans, and I want to try to tell you how this came about. My own theory. This is my own narrative of how we got to where we are. So I think, in my view, long ago on this planet, but all over the planet, we understood how to live in community on the commons. And that's actually a complicated thing to do. societies understood this. And if you go back to indigenous ways of knowing in Africa, in South America, in Mesoamerica, in Europe, and all over the place, you'll discover that there's instructions on how to do this thing. And then we actually broke it. The colonial era, we basically went around and stamped out all these heathen cultures that didn't understand anything, that didn't have any good knowledge for us. We broke it, and then much later, plenty of history happens in between, we lost faith in humans. I think it was maybe how stupid World War I was, I don't know, but we lost faith in humans, and we handed the world over to engineers and managers to design everything for efficiency, scale, and profit. And these were mostly men. We proceeded to tell them, don't pay attention to meaning, purpose, love, trust, society. Those are all woo-woo things. Those are all, they don't really count, or automate them if you possibly can. So in the process, they industrialized, standardized, automated. I'm really interested in this word consumerized. And the aha for me several years ago was that, OMG, we consumerized everything, not just consumer goods, right? We consumerized culture. We used to memorize plays and sing to each other. Now it's Nintendo or Netflix. We are now consumers of medical services. Our governments think of us as consumers. And that's really a break in what was happening. So these people designed a series of institutions from mistrust and normalized some very odd behaviors. Some really strange stuff became completely normal. For example, the language of advertising is the language of a military campaign. These people are going to war on us. They launch campaigns against target demographics. They send flights of messages. They pay by the impression. They love captive markets. They're trying to achieve market penetration. What? This is sort of normal because it's the only way companies know to talk to us. They don't know how to be in relationship with us. As a result, Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, the stalker economy is very, very real. Most companies are in the stalker economy up to their nostrils because they don't know how else to do things. And they're busy paying a lot of money to a lot of companies to hoover up our data and use it against us. Don't get me started on the compulsory education system. I've done a TEDx talk which is all about this. The compulsory education system creates scarcity at every turn. We don't trust our children to be curious or to go learn things. We've been busy overprotecting intellectual property for years. Our police are now military. We have all the gear that came off of Iraq and Afghanistan has gone to local police departments who now look like warriors. Yet the crime rate drops when you go in and start doing community policing. So this is all very strange. In the process, we treated our citizens as mere consumers. And when you're trying to defend citizens, you want their rights, you want equity, you want fairness, you want a bunch of things. When you're trying to protect consumers, you want cheap goods available all over the place. So keeping trust broken in these ways serves a lot of interests. Funny enough, now we're busy rediscovering trust, almost innocently, almost in some weird, naive way. We're like, oh my gosh, look, trust. And so I call this, and I've been sort of worrying this issue for 20, 25 years, so I'm starting to call this design from trust. And I don't mean design for trust, I mean design from a basic assumption that people are more trustworthy than we think they are. And you're familiar with this, you've heard this language before. Assume good intent is one of the words of the open source movement, or any open movement. So here is a collection, assume I'm some kind of strange collector of systems designed from trust. This is a grab basket of these sorts of systems. Open source software. The internet was designed from trust. Open everything, open hardware, open process unit, open government, certainly. Crowdsourcing, restorative justice, policing by consent, even animal gentling. Crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, cooperatives. You'll be hearing about platform cooperatives here at the conference. Participatory governance, open space, and on conferences we have an open space at the end of the days here. All of these things are designed from trust. They're designed to assume that the people coming in are trying to do something good together, which doesn't seem like that big a reach, right? So one of the cool things about systems designed from trust is that they elicit typically two responses. There's almost predictable responses. The first response is, oh shit, there's no way this is going to work. This is craziness. These people are doing what? And then, like, don't they know that there's bad actors out there? Aren't they aware that there's terrible people going to come in and the tragedy of the commons, you name it. It's like, well, these communities know about bad actors. They know how to deal with them. They deal with them in different ways because the second realization you get, once you see that the bad actors are dealt with and we're creating something magical together is, oh shit, no way. This thing really works. This is kind of cool. Maybe I'd like a little bit more of this, right? So let me tell you a couple little stories of how this evolved for me. We'll go a little deeper into traffic calming, for instance, because in 2006 I was lucky enough to go to Drachten in the Netherlands and meet this fellow, Hans Monderman, who's kind of the father of traffic calming. He went in cities across the Netherlands for years and probably did this to 140 cities, redesigning streets and intersections, trusting that the people would make eye contact at the intersection, drivers, pedestrians, motorcyclists, etc., and make their way across. And it turns out when you do that, when you remove the physical things we try to put in place to create safety, the accident rates go down. It's a safer environment because you're trusting the humans to go through. This was a big wake-up call for me. Let's pay a little attention to pattern languages. And unfortunately, if we had a lot more time, I could go around this whole diagram for quite a while. So this fellow, Christopher Alexander, a very eccentric and a genius who is an urban planner and an architect, with some colleagues wrote this book, A Pattern Language, back in the early 80s. And pattern languages are ways of distilling wisdom in any field. Pattern languages are now very popular in software, probably more popular there than in architecture, because he's such a quirky individual. But pattern languages are ways of distilling the wisdom of the field to give it to your average civilian, your average citizen, so that they can participate in the design process as not quite equals, but boy, they're really mixed into it, instead of just deciding what color knobs to put in the kitchen. So just to give you a quick way of looking at trust, designed for mistrust systems apply control because they need to control those bad actors first. They're designing for efficiency and scale, and they highlight individualism, but really a lot of it turns into coercion. If you're designing from trust, you're really looking for cooperation. You're going to deal with the bad actors last. They're still going to exist. This is not a naive look, but we're really aiming to release the genius in the room and to help people thrive in different ways. Really, we're going to play on interdependence of all the players in community, which sounds pretty lovely. Now, tech is really complicated here. It cuts both ways. The moment it connects us all and suddenly the cost of building community goes to zero, it exposes us and masks us and does a whole bunch of other things we don't want. It addicts and distracts us. The moment it empowers us and gives us a high-definition movie studio in your hand, for example, with your phone, it also empowers people with really terrible intent to go do things. The moment it democratizes, it also hijacks us. And we have not figured out how to have this conversation very well. The recent incidents are basically playing up these gaps. What's interesting is a few very well-funded people are like, well, let's just get off this rock. We've broken this rock, so let's just go populate other places. And I will tell them that unless we figure out trust, you do not want to be on the first 1,000 spaceships going off this rock. It doesn't, I'll tell you, Kim Stanley Robinson, et cetera, doesn't end well. This place, this lovely, lovely conference that Micha and Andrew developed, is fertile soil for design from trust. You will hear from lots of different countries. Pia is speaking right after me. She's Argentine. Half the crew from Taiwan is actually in the room, and we'll be doing a workshop later. Germany has liquid democracy. Iceland redid its constitution. Estonia has e-everything, X-Road, and I'm an Estonian e-citizen, e-resident. So is my wife. There are participatory, deliberative, and open things all over the place. And later today, we're going to be doing these open spaces. An open space, how many people have been in an open space before? A few of you. And I'm not sure we're doing the full process here, but open spaces are these sort of gut-tightening things where you walk in, you're like, wait a minute, it's on us, and nothing happens unless we step up. That's pretty interesting. So design from trust has a bunch of interesting properties. I'm calling out a couple here. One is that the genius actually gets to show up. Because right now, you're an audience and I'm on stage. And I usually teach people the hand signs from Occupy. I'm like, if you like what I said, jazz hands up. If you don't like what I said, jazz hands down. It gives me a reading for where your emotions are during the meeting. And suddenly, you're not just sitting there and I'm not just sort of staring out over the seats. The creators of these design from trust systems often look like crazy people. And often what they're saying is so heretical to their discipline that they get marginalized. They get sent off to the sidelines. They wind up, in many cases, being sort of bitter old folk because their colleagues couldn't understand this trust bargain. And then another thing is that trust can be much cheaper than control. When you imagine what it costs to monitor, measure, record, save, prosecute, and control anything, the money we pour into systems of control and coercion, And then the genius that shows up, and just the volunteer nature of trust, mostly, of people participating along certain rules, it gets super interesting. So what might you do right now? What are the kinds of things that you could do today? First, mind the word consumer. See where it shows up. If I've done anything, I want to plant an earworm in your brain that itches every now and then when you hear the word consumer. For me, having 25 years of this, I do a little jump when I hear the word. And when I talk at a conference later, I get little side glances from people as others in the room use the word. It's pretty interesting. But consider purging it from your organization's vocabulary. Because if you're going to change people's point of view, one way to do it is to change their vocabulary. And think of those people formerly known as consumers as citizens, people, individuals. Customers and clients are fine. Students, members, participants. I like the word allies. Ally implies that we're actually pulling on the rope in the same direction together. Explore breaches of trust, in particular the ones you can't see. So these, I call them the hidden architectures of mistrust. The explicit architectures of mistrust are the barbed wire and the lock on the door. The implicit ones are stoplights at the intersection, where somebody has decided that we must put stoplights that have an intersection or people will kill each other going through, instead of rethinking how to design those intersections. Learn to design from trust, and if you'd like to do more of this, a handy thing, we have a workshop coming up at 2:30 this afternoon, which I encourage you to attend. And with that, thank you very, very much. Oh, that's right.
Thanks, Jerry.
I was about to exit stage right.
Oh, no, this is a new process.
That's right.
So get your Slidos up. We're going to ask some questions. But first of all, it is true, in room W220 today, Jerry is going to be leading a workshop with John Kelly, his facilitator. It's going to be pretty great, I think. So, right? Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it was a really interesting talk. So let's go to some of the Q&A. We already have a question up here. How can we bring back the wisdom of ancient societies in this changed context?
I don't know how this came up so quickly. This is one of the most profound things we can do, is go back and rediscover what we once knew. Seriously. Ancient societies around the world had really nice ways of bringing people into society. We used to grow up with graduated responsibility in community. Everybody knew who we were. And it varies by culture, by where you go around the world. But I sort of reject the notion that we were small, stupid, tribal, and very violent before. And look, civilization has been progressing upwards, and soon we'll go through the singularity. I think that's mostly BS. I think we were really smart once. We kind of broke that. And along the way, suddenly we have these gadgets that are like made of unobtainium and can do anything, right? And we're too young, sort of in a consciousness way, to actually use them properly. So if we could catch up a little bit by catching up with our history, we might actually make better decisions about using all this stuff for democracy.
It's interesting. And speaking of those gadgets, we have another question up there that's, isn't it part of the problem that some of these tools and social media platforms were designed without enough thought into how they were misused, so that they were designed maybe without considering mistrust?
Absolutely. So in his book, In the Absence of the Sacred, Jerry Mander has a whole page on the car. And he says, if we had known that we were going to pave over all our cities, that we were going to pollute the atmosphere, that we were going to fight wars over the natural resources of the car and all the other external effects of cars, would we have allowed them to go ahead as they did? And it's mostly a rhetorical question because, as Kevin Kelly writes, sort of technology has this imperative. It takes us places. It does things, right? And so I don't know how you steer better, except you get more awareness of the consequences of your actions, and you try to play out what is it that we're breaking as we implement this. And Zuckerberg and crew were insanely naive to believe that they could connect 2.2 billion humans, not that they thought that was going to happen when it was just a thing at Harvard to find girls, right? That's what they were doing, their perspective. But that they were incredibly naive to think that it wouldn't have really massive social effects. And small side tangent, I did a project for Target many years ago in early online days where they were being given, their store online was being provided by Amazon. And Amazon was already famous for micro-targeting and all this analytic work. And I'm like, oh, great, so what are you doing? And it turned out that Amazon was giving them the complete junior varsity version of Amazon, where it was like they were putting products on the shelf and they'd got no data, they got nothing. Facebook has built this genius micro everything enterprise and given the keys of it to anybody who wants to show up and pay $30 to advertise. It's the opposite, and it's insane.
Guilty, maybe we did advertise on Facebook. So I like the next question that's been upvoted, which you guys can do. You can ask questions and upvote them. How do we build trust amongst people who have different or even opposite opinions or belief systems about where you start to design? Maybe people, I remember in college, a professor I worked with had studied different opinions of how trust functioned, like kinship versus institutional versus familial. How do we deal with that? So
later this afternoon we have a workshop. We have 3 experts who are also joining us to facilitate. One of them is Rosa Subisarreta, who is sitting right there. If you'll raise your hand for a second. Thanks, Rosa. She's an expert in deliberative facilitation. There are a series of group process techniques that understand how to bring people together and begin looking for what they could do together. There's another process called appreciative inquiry, for example. But partly, there's a much simpler solution, which is breaking bread, listening to music together, other kinds of, like food is a really great connector, right? Food, right? Food is a terrific connector. So get people to see each other as human first, before you try to do anything big like conquer the great political divide.
Yeah. We have a couple questions now. I'm going to go to one that's kind of interesting. What practices can websites implement to encourage trust? Like maybe that's a question you'll answer during your workshop. But.
We have 90 minutes in the workshop. Can't cover that much.
Yeah.
So the funny thing is that I wrote about, as you saw the cover of that issue of Release 1.0, online community in '93. And I had been on The Well and CompuServe and a bunch of other things. And what's interesting is that, like the word open and other sorts of things, once they get popular, everybody's got one. And a whole lot of companies said, oh, we have online community. Look, come to our website and go to our discussion forum. I'm like, real people? Well, if you're hosting a terrific conversation and the ground rules really work and you're achieving something larger for the people who show up, then maybe yours becomes the place where people congregate and go do this thing. But likely not. And likely those communities exist somewhere else. The second meeting that got me down this consumer thing that goes back to my meeting with the CEO of women.com was a guy who was doing, he came to pitch me a gaming site he was going to create. And he describes it, and basically he was going to data mine everything. He was going to give quizzes to all the players, and I was like, you've just described a chicken coop with snipers in the high windows. Like, what is this? Right? And this is today a normalized and natural business model. I mean, I look pretty naive and ignorant from back then, but this is the kind of thing that's been done. So I think doing community well is actually relatively difficult and takes letting go of having to be the only owner and host of it and participating as a peer wherever that community is showing up and giving it power tools so that it can actually flourish.
Yeah, we have about a minute and a half left. So one more question. How do we protect existing systems of trust from our cynicism? A lot of people are feeling, oh, trust? That is still woo-woo for some people. How do we get into that?
A piece of my talk that I had to dump overboard, sort of like bags of sand, so you make it across the ocean in 15 minutes, involved how trust has been sort of weaponized against us now. So tolerance, trust are being undermined intentionally as a tactic in a large battle to confuse the battlefield so that we don't know whom to trust, so we don't know what to do, so we don't know what's next. I recommend watching a documentary by Adam Curtis titled Hypernormalization. I see a bunch of nodding heads that basically says we are already in a nonlinear warfare where trust is being used against us. So I'm actually being an optimist in the middle of this. I think I'm a realist optimist, where I see how badly this has been used against us in different ways, and yet I don't see alternatives to figuring out how to trust one another again, how to trust the other. Here I recommend watching Anand Giridharadas's talks online, his Aspen Institute talk where he says, look, we're part of the problem. I love you, your family, but we're a part of the problem. He did a TEDx talk where he says, I'm apologizing to the other who has been harmed. I listened, but I wasn't hearing you. We need to do a lot of that. And we need to just be gentle and step back and realize that it's a little bit like how to be a good ally. It's not all about you. It's not all about, but sometimes it is about you. Right? We got to remember those things because there's a lot of wisdom in those things.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry. I've learned a lot this morning about trust, and I think you really set us up for the rest of the day and thinking big questions, big ideas about trust. So
That makes me very happy.
Yeah, thanks for framing
Thank you.
it. Yeah.